The call came on a Tuesday in March, which was unusual only because I wasn't the person they should have been calling. I'd been retired for almost 3 years by then, living in Flagstaff, spending most of my mornings walking the same 4-mile loop through the Ponderosa stands north of town, spending most of my afternoons doing very little. My knees had opinions about stairs. My left shoulder still clicked when the weather changed. I was 63 years old, and I had made my peace with the fact that my career was behind me. The woman on the phone identified herself as Deputy Superintendent Lena Seward, NPS Intermountain Region. She was polite, efficient. She told me she'd gotten my name from 2 separate people in the regional SAR coordinator's office, and that she was calling because they had a situation that had outgrown its original parameters. I asked her what kind of situation. She said a 12-year-old boy named Caleb Royce had been missing for 6 days in the Sandia Mountains east of Albuquerque. Initial search had been aggressive ground teams, K-9, helicopter, Civil Air Patrol, fixed wing, drones, the full weight of Bernalillo County SAR plus a Type 1 team out of Santa Fe. 6 days of good weather, experienced personnel, no result. Not a piece of clothing, not a wrapper, not a footprint past a certain point on the trail. I told her I was sorry to hear it, and I meant it. But I also told her that I wasn't sure what a retired ranger with bad knees could offer that a Type 1 team couldn't. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made me sit down. She said the boy's mother had been on the mountain every day since the search began. She wasn't interfering. She wasn't hysterical. She was simply walking the same trail her son had walked, alone, methodically, grid by grid, sunrise to sunset. And she was finding things. Not her son. Things that shouldn't have been there. If you've spent time in these mountains and you appreciate hearing what actually happens out there, the parts that don't always make it into the official reports, I'd ask you to subscribe to this channel. These stories come from a long career, and I'm glad to have a place to share them. I asked Lena Seward what kind of things. She told me the mother, her name was Dana Royce, had found a child's sneaker on day 3. Left foot, correct size, correct brand. It was sitting upright in the center of the La Luz Trail at 8,400 feet, placed precisely on the granite, laces still tied. The search teams had walked that section 11 times. It had not been there before. On day 4, Dana found a granola bar wrapper the same brand Caleb had been carrying, folded into a perfect square and tucked beneath a cairnstone near the ridgeline. The cairn was one the Forest Service had built years ago. The wrapper was dry, no tooth marks, no animal interference. Folded with a precision that Dana said her son was incapable of. Caleb was, in her words, a crumpler. On day 5, she found his water bottle. It was standing upright on a flat rock 60 feet off trail in a scree field that 3 separate K-9 teams had swept. The bottle was full, not with water, with small stones, each one roughly the same size, packed so tightly that when the SAR team leader shook it, nothing moved. Lena told me the team had handled each find correctly. Evidence bags, GPS coordinates, chain of custody, everything was logged. But she said the morale problem was becoming worse than the search problem. The handlers couldn't explain why their dogs hadn't alerted in areas where physical evidence later appeared. The team leaders couldn't explain how objects were being placed in sectors that had been cleared and documented. 2 of the volunteers had declined to return after day 5. One of the K-9 handlers had formally requested reassignment. And Dana Royce kept walking. I asked Lena why she was calling me instead of bringing in a fresh Type 1 team or requesting FBI assistance. Since a missing child case passed 72 hours with no evidence of voluntary departure, usually triggers federal interest. She said the FBI had been contacted. They had reviewed the case file remotely and concluded that the physical evidence, the shoe, the wrapper, the bottle, was consistent with someone placing objects deliberately, which pointed toward either a custody dispute or a third-party abduction with a psychological component. The Bureau's preliminary assessment was that a person, not the wilderness, was responsible for Caleb's disappearance. They were monitoring. They were not yet deploying. The problem, Lena said, was that no one on the mountain believed that assessment. She said the people who had been searching, rangers, deputies, experienced SAR volunteers, people who had collectively spent thousands of hours in the Sandias, were increasingly unwilling to articulate what they did believe. But they were behaving differently, staying closer together, finishing shifts early, logging shorter routes than assigned. She said the incident commander, a Bernalillo County sergeant named Ortiz, had started walking the perimeter of base camp every night with a flashlight, checking the tree line, and when she'd asked him what he was looking for, he'd said he didn't know. What she wanted from me, specifically, was not search expertise. She had that. What she wanted was someone with enough field authority to walk with Dana Royce, assess what Dana was finding, determine whether the discoveries had a rational explanation, and either restore confidence in the search or provide grounds for a fundamentally different approach. She said the two people who had recommended me both used the same word: credible. I told her I'd drive down in the morning. The Sandia Mountains sit directly against the eastern edge of Albuquerque. Most people in the city see them every day, a long, tilted wall of granite and limestone, running roughly north-south. The crest just above 10,000 feet. The western face a dramatic escarpment that catches the sunset and turns the color the range is named for. Sandia, watermelon. From the city side, the mountains look like scenery, a backdrop, something you photograph from a brewery parking lot. From the east side, where the terrain drops into pinon and juniper foothills and the canyons cut back into the granite, the Sandias are something else. They're steep, compressed, geologically complex, and deceptively dangerous for a range you can see from a Walmart. The vertical relief from the Rio Grande to the crest is more than 5,000 feet in less than 4 horizontal miles. The trails gain elevation fast. The weather at the top has almost no relationship to the weather at the bottom. I've known experienced hikers who drove from Albuquerque to the La Luz trailhead in shorts and arrived at the crest in a snowstorm. Caleb Royce had entered the mountain from the east side. The family lived in a small subdivision called Sandia Park, tucked into the Pinon Hills along the backside of the range, maybe 20 minutes from the crest by car. According to the incident report Lena had emailed me, Caleb had left home on foot at approximately 7:15 a.m. on a Saturday morning in early March. He'd told his mother he was hiking to a spot he called the Rock Garden, a jumble of granite boulders about 1.5 miles up a connector trail that linked the neighborhood to the Crest Trails system. Dana had let him go. He'd made the hike before, more than a dozen times. He carried water, a snack, a whistle, and a fully charged phone. He was a strong hiker for his age. He knew the trail. His phone had pinged a tower near the trailhead at 7:22 a.m., again at the junction with the Crest Trail at 7:58 a.m., and once more at 8:14 a.m. from a location consistent with the Rock Garden area. After that, no signal. The phone either died, was turned off, or moved into one of the many granite-shielded dead zones that pocketed the upper mountain. Dana called him at 10 a.m. No answer. She called again at 10:30, again at 11. At noon, she drove to the trailhead and walked up. She found nothing at the Rock Garden. She walked farther up, calling his name. By 2 p.m., she had contacted Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office. And by 3 p.m., the first search teams were on the mountain. That had been 6 days ago. I arrived at the search base camp at 9:40 a.m. on Wednesday. Base had been established at the east side trailhead parking area, a gravel lot ringed by piñon pine. With a portable command tent, 2 county sheriff vehicles, a Forest Service truck, and a handful of civilian cars. For a 6-day search involving a child, the scene was notably quiet. I'd expected more vehicles, more media presence, more of the organized chaos that usually accompanies a high-profile missing juvenile case. Instead, there were maybe 15 people visible. A few in SAR orange, a few in county brown, a couple in Forest Service green. They were standing in small groups, drinking coffee, talking in low voices. Nobody was moving with urgency. Nobody was studying maps on the hood of a truck or loading packs for a morning deployment. The energy was wrong. I'd been on enough searches to know what the 7th day looks like when people still believe the subject is findable, and this wasn't it. But it also wasn't the grim resignation of a body recovery. It was something in between. Something I didn't immediately have a word for. I found Sergeant Ortiz in the command tent. He was a compact man in his late 40s with a shaved head and the kind of deep-set calm that either comes from exceptional self-control or prolonged exhaustion. In his case, I suspected both. He shook my hand, offered me coffee from a thermos, and told me he was glad someone from outside the immediate operation was coming in. I asked him to walk me through the search chronology. He did, methodically. Days 1 and 2 had been textbook, hasty teams on all likely trails. K-9 deployed on the boys' scent from a pillowcase Dana provided. Helicopter running the crest and both flanks. Ground teams expanding outward from the rock garden in concentric grids. Weather had cooperated. Visibility was excellent. Temperatures were cold at the crest, low 20s at night, but manageable for a healthy 12-year-old with a jacket, which Caleb had been wearing. They found nothing. Not nothing as in no boy. Nothing as in no evidence of passage. Beyond the rock garden, where they found a few scuffed boot prints consistent with Caleb's size and tread pattern, there was no trail to follow. The K-9 teams picked up scent moving north from the rock garden along the crest trail for approximately 600 meters. Then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. 2 different dogs from 2 different handlers hit the same wall. The scent simply ceased, as if Caleb had been lifted off the ground. Ortiz said the handlers had conferred privately. They didn't offer a theory in front of the group, but one of them, a woman named Gutierrez, who had been doing K-9 SAR for 11 years, told Ortiz after her shift that in her experience, a scent trail terminates that cleanly only in 2 circumstances. One is a water crossing. There was no water within 300 meters of the cutoff point. The other is vehicle extraction. The subject gets into a car, on a trail at 9,200 feet with no road access. Day 3 was when Dana found the shoe. Ortiz told me that when she brought it down to base camp, the reaction among the team was immediate and conflicted. The shoe was real. It was Caleb's. Donna identified it without hesitation, and the size, brand, and wear pattern matched what they'd cataloged from the boys' closet. But it had been found, sitting upright, in the center of a trail section that had been walked by a 4-person team less than 2 hours earlier. The team leader, a SAR volunteer named Crane, was adamant. He had walked that section personally. The shoe was not there. I asked Ortiz what he'd made of it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said he'd initially assumed someone had found the shoe in a different location and moved it accidentally or intentionally before Dana arrived. It was the simplest explanation. He'd questioned every team member who had been in that sector. None of them had found or moved anything. The granola bar wrapper on day 4 had been harder to dismiss. The cairn where Dana found it was a known landmark. Multiple teams had used it as a waypoint. Ortiz himself had stood beside it on day 2 and rested his hand on the exact stone under which the wrapper was found. There had been nothing beneath it. And the water bottle on day 5, the one packed full of stones, had been discovered in a scree field that Ortiz had personally flagged as too steep and unstable for a child to cross. He'd diverted search resources away from that sector specifically because the terrain was impassable for a 12-year-old. But the bottle was there, standing upright, full of stones. Caleb's name written on the cap in Dana's handwriting, the same way she'd labeled it before he left the house. I asked Ortiz if there was any possibility that Dana herself was placing the objects. He didn't hesitate. He said he'd considered it. He said he'd had one of his deputies quietly shadow Dana on day 5 without her knowledge, maintaining visual contact from approximately 200 meters. Dana had walked steadily, scanning the terrain with methodical patience. And when she found the bottle, her reaction was immediate and visceral. She'd dropped to her knees. She'd held the bottle against her chest. She'd stayed like that for almost a minute before she stood up and carefully carried it back down to base camp. The deputy told Ortiz there was no possibility she had placed the bottle. She had found it exactly as she appeared to find it. I asked Ortiz the question I'd been building toward since I sat down. I asked him why, after 6 days, he thought the boy had not been found. He set his coffee down. He looked at the map pinned to the tent wall, a topo of the Sandayas with search sectors marked in colored tape, each one annotated with dates, team names, and results. He said every sector had been searched to standard. Several had been searched to well above standard. The terrain had been covered. The coverage was documented. The mountain was not that big. A 12-year-old boy, alive or dead, in a range this compact, with this much resource applied 6 days, was enough. They should have found something definitive. A body, a shelter, a direction of travel. Something. Instead, they had found 3 objects that someone had placed for Dana Royce to find, in locations where those objects had previously not existed, in a pattern that suggested not randomness, but intention. Then he told me something that wasn't in the incident report. On day 5, after the water bottle discovery, Ortiz had hiked alone to the scree field where the bottle had been found. He wanted to examine the spot himself. He reached the flat rock where the bottle had been standing and found that the surface was clean, dry, and unremarkable. But when he crouched down and looked more closely, he saw that someone had scratched a single word into the granite with a sharp stone. The word was Mom. The letters were rough, uneven, scratched with effort by someone who had pressed hard enough to leave white marks in the dark rock surface. Ortiz photographed it. He measured the letters, each one approximately 3 inches tall. He noted that the scratches were fresh. No lichen, no weathering, no dust in the grooves. He hadn't told anyone except Lena Seward. I asked him why. He said because the word wasn't there when his deputy watched Dana find the bottle 2 hours earlier. The deputy had been watching through binoculars from an elevated position with a clear sight line to the rock. Dana had knelt beside the rock and picked up the bottle. She had not looked at the surface of the rock. She had not scratched anything. The word appeared after Dana left. I sat with that for a while. Then I asked Ortiz where Dana Royce was right now. He pointed up the trail. She was already on the mountain. I found Dana Royce at approximately 8,800 feet, sitting on a boulder beside the main connector trail, drinking water from a Nalgene bottle and studying a topographic map she'd spread across her knees. She was younger than I'd expected, late 30s, maybe 40, with sun-darkened skin and short brown hair held back with a band. She wore trail runners, hiking pants, a fleece pullover, and a day pack that looked like it had been repacked with the same careful discipline every morning for a week. She looked up when she heard me on the trail and watched me approach without surprise. She'd been told I was coming. I introduced myself, told her my name, told her I was retired NPS, told her Deputy Superintendent Seward had asked me to assist with the search. I didn't say anything about assessing her credibility or evaluating her finds. I didn't need to. She was a perceptive woman, and I could tell from the way she studied me that she understood exactly what my presence meant. She said, "They sent you to decide whether I'm credible or crazy." I told her they sent me because what she'd been finding deserved better attention than it had been getting. She considered that. Then she folded her map and said, "Walk with me." We started uphill together. The trail was well maintained, a packed dirt and granite path winding through mixed conifer, gaining about 1,000 feet per mile. The morning air was thin and cool at that elevation, and I could feel the altitude in my lungs immediately. Flagstaff sits at 7,000 feet, so I wasn't starting from sea level, but I also wasn't in the kind of shape that made 9,000-foot trail work casual. Dana moved at a pace that told me she'd been doing this every day for a week, and her body had adjusted to the routine. I matched her without comment. She talked as we walked. Not frantically, not emotionally. She talked the way people talk when they have been alone with a problem for too long and finally have someone who might be capable of hearing it. She told me about Caleb. He was her only child. His father had left when Caleb was 4, moved to Phoenix, sent checks intermittently, and had no involvement in daily life. Caleb was quiet, bookish, fascinated by geology and astronomy, the kind of kid who would rather sit on a rock and study lichen than throw a football. He had started hiking with Dana when he was 6 and had developed a genuine, unperformative love for the mountain that sat behind their house. He knew the trails. He knew the landmarks. He knew which side of the ridge held snow in March and which side was clear. He was not the kind of child who wandered off a trail. I asked her about the morning he'd left. She recounted it simply. He'd eaten cereal. He'd packed his day pack water, granola bars, a windbreaker, his phone. He'd told her he was going to the rock garden, which was a rounded granite outcrop about 1.5 miles up the trail, where he liked to sit and look west toward the city. He'd been there many times. She had no reason to worry. She paused. We were passing through a dense stand of Douglas fir, and the light changed as the canopy closed over the trail. When she spoke again, her voice was the same, but something underneath it had shifted. She said, "The morning he left, he hugged me. He doesn't always do that. He's 12. He's in the phase where physical affection is embarrassing. But that morning, he came over and put his arms around me and held on for about 5 seconds. And then he left." She stopped walking. She looked at me directly. "I don't know what that means," she said. "I've been trying not to make it mean anything, but I think about it every time I start up this trail." I told her I understood. We kept walking. We reached the rock garden at approximately 10:15 a.m. It was exactly what she'd described, a cluster of weathered granite boulders sitting on a natural shelf with a clear view to the west. Albuquerque was visible below, spread across the Rio Grande Valley in the morning light. The river a green thread through brown terrain. The spot felt like a place a thoughtful 12-year-old would claim as his own. Dana showed me the scuff marks that the search teams had identified as Caleb's. They were faint boot tread impressions in a thin layer of decomposed granite on top of the bedrock. She pointed to a specific boulder, the one Caleb always sat on. It was flat-topped, about waist-high, positioned perfectly for looking out over the valley. There was nothing unusual about the site, nothing that felt wrong or displaced. It was just a quiet, beautiful spot on a mountain, and a boy had been sitting here 8 days ago. And then he wasn't. Dana said, "This is where the dogs lose him." I looked north, up the trail toward the crest. The crest trail continued another 2 miles to the summit, gaining elevation through switchbacks above the tree line. The terrain was open, exposed, and on a clear day which this was visible for long distances. 600 meters up, she said. Both dogs, same spot. I asked her if she'd show me. She adjusted her pack and started north without a word. We walked in silence for a while. The trail left the fir canopy and entered a transition zone, scattered spruce, rocky ground, patches of old snow in the shaded north-facing pockets. The wind picked up. At this elevation, even in March, the sun was intense on exposed skin, but the air temperature dropped noticeably every time we passed through the shadow. Dana stopped at a point where the trail crossed a shallow saddle between 2 rocky knobs. There was nothing remarkable about the spot. No landmark, no junction, just a section of trail like 100 others. "Here," she said, "this is where the scent ends." I looked around. The saddle was open, windswept, with low scrub and fractured granite extending in every direction. There was no water feature, no cliff, no structure, no road, no reason for a scent trail to terminate. I asked her what she thought happened here. She said, "I don't know." Then she said, "But this is where I started finding things." She told me that on day 3, the morning she found the shoe, she'd been standing in this exact spot. She'd been standing still, not moving, just looking at the landscape and trying to think like her son, trying to imagine what he would have seen, what would have drawn his attention, which direction he might have gone if he'd left the trail. And while she was standing there, she'd felt something she described as a pull. Not physical, not auditory, not visual, just a sense as clear as a tap on the shoulder that she should walk south. Back down the trail, back toward the section she'd already walked through. She'd followed the feeling. 20 minutes later, she found the shoe. Every discovery since then had started the same way. She would walk, she would stop, she would feel the pull, and she would find something. I asked her if the pull ever came when other people were with her. She shook her head. Only when she was alone. I stood in that saddle on the Sandia crest, with the wind pressing against my jacket and the city glittering 5,000 feet below. And I thought about what Sergeant Ortiz had told me, and what the K9 handler had told Ortiz, and what the deputy had observed through his binoculars, and what had been scratched into the rock after everyone had left. And I thought about a 12-year-old boy who had hugged his mother before walking up a mountain he knew by heart, and who had vanished at a spot on the trail where even dogs couldn't follow. I told Dana I'd like to walk with her tomorrow. She said, "I start at sunrise." I told her I'd be there. I was at the east side trailhead at 6:20 a.m. The sky was still violet along the crest, the granite catching the first amber light, while the foothills below remained in cold shadow. The parking area was empty, except for Dana's car, a silver Subaru with a child's booster seat still visible in the back, and my rental. The command tent was dark. The search teams wouldn't deploy for another hour, if they deployed at all, Ortiz had told me the previous evening that he was scaling operations back to a maintenance level. 4 ground teams instead of 12. No helicopter. The formal justification was resource management. The real reason was that his people were finding excuses not to go up. Dana was already on the trail. I could see her headlamp moving through the piñon about 200 yards above the parking area. A small point of light ascending steadily. I shouldered my pack water, first aid kit, radio, binoculars, a notebook, and the GPS unit I'd borrowed from Ortiz and followed. I caught up with her at the first switchback. She acknowledged me with a nod, but didn't slow down. We climbed in the gray pre-dawn quiet, our breathing and footsteps the only sounds. The trail was dry, the air cold enough that I could see my breath in the beam of my headlamp. A Stellar's jay called once from somewhere in the fur stand to our left and then went silent. By the time we reached the rock garden, the sun had cleared the crest and the western valley was filling with gold light. Dana didn't stop. She passed through Caleb's spot without looking at it and kept climbing. I followed. We reached the saddle descent termination point at approximately 7:40 a.m. Dana stopped. She stood still, facing north, her hands at her sides. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't adopt any posture that suggested ritual or concentration. She simply stood and waited. I stayed about 10 feet behind her and said nothing. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The wind moved across the saddle in steady pulses. I watched a red-tailed hawk working a thermal to the southeast, rising in slow circles against the pale sky. The granite under my boots was cold through the soles. At about the 15-minute mark, Dana turned. Not north, east. She looked directly into a drainage I hadn't paid much attention to the day before, a narrow, steep-sided cut in the ridge that dropped away from the saddle into a tangle of mixed spruce and rock. The drainage was shaded, north-facing, still holding dirty snow in its deeper recesses. It was not a trail route. There was no path into it. The topo map showed it descending roughly 1,000 feet before merging with a larger canyon system on the east flank of the range. Dana said, "There." I looked at the drainage. I looked at her. I asked her if this was the pull she'd described. She said yes. I asked her if it felt the same as the other times. She hesitated. Then she said, "Stronger." I studied the drainage entrance. The terrain was not technical, but it was rough, loose rock, deadfall, steep grade, no visible game trail. A 12-year-old could navigate it, but it would be slow going and the footing would be treacherous. It was also, I noted, the kind of terrain that a dog team would have been directed around rather than through. Too much loose substrate. Too many scent-dispersing air currents funneling through the narrow cut. I pulled out the GPS unit and marked our position. Then I keyed the radio and called Ortiz at base camp. I told him Dana and I were going to explore an uncleared drainage east of the saddle at the scent termination point. I gave him coordinates. I told him we'd check in every 30 minutes and that if he didn't hear from us by noon, he should send someone up, Ortiz acknowledged. His voice was flat, neutral. He didn't ask why. We started down into the drainage. The first 300 feet of descent were unremarkable. Loose granite, scattered spruce, old snow in the shadows. I was watching the ground carefully, partly for footing, partly out of habit, partly because I was looking for any sign that a child had passed through here. Boot impressions, broken branches, scuffed lichen on rock surfaces, displaced stones. The small, unconscious marks that even a careful hiker leaves in terrain this rough. I found nothing. The drainage floor looked undisturbed. Dana moved ahead of me with a certainty that wasn't reckless, but also wasn't tentative. She picked her route through the deadfall and rock as if she could see a path that I couldn't. I watched her feet. She wasn't following tracks. She was following something else. At approximately 8:15 a.m., maybe 500 feet below the saddle, the drainage narrowed and deepened. The walls on either side rose to about 20 feet rough granite faces with sparse vegetation clinging to the cracks. The floor was mostly bedrock here, scoured clean by seasonal water flow. A thin trickle of snowmelt ran down the center, barely enough to darken the stone. Dana stopped. She was looking at the left wall of the drainage. I came up beside her and looked. There was a mark on the rock, not scratched, drawn. Someone had used a piece of charcoal or something that left a black, powdery residue to draw a symbol on the granite face at roughly chest height for an adult, or arm's reach for a child. It was an arrow, simple. Straight shaft, angled head, pointing deeper into the drainage. I examined it closely without touching it. The charcoal was fresh. It smudged faintly when I held my hand near it and felt no resistance in the texture. No weathering. No rainwash. The lines were uneven, drawn with moderate pressure by someone whose hand was either small or unsteady. I photographed it. GPS marked the position. Noted the exact dimensions in my notebook shaft, approximately 8 inches long, head approximately 3 inches wide. Drawn at a height of 54 inches from the drainage floor. Dana was staring at the arrow. Her expression was controlled, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers had curled around the straps of her pack. She said, "That's his height." I looked at her. She said, 54 inches. That's how tall Caleb is. He would have drawn that right at eye level. I didn't say anything for a moment. The drainage was quiet, except for the thin sound of water over stone. The walls blocked the wind. The air was still and cold. I asked her if Caleb had ever used charcoal to draw or mark things. She shook her head slowly. Then she stopped and corrected herself. She said that last summer, during a camping trip in the Jemez Mountains, Caleb had pulled a piece of charcoal from a dead campfire and spent an hour drawing on a flat rock near their tent. He'd drawn a map of the trail they'd hiked. He'd been meticulous about it, landmarks, distances, little annotations in his careful handwriting. She said she still had a photograph of it on her phone. I asked her to show me. She found the image and held the phone out. I looked at the photograph. A flat, gray stone. Covered in charcoal lines, a surprisingly detailed trail map drawn by a child who paid attention to the world. In the upper right corner of the map, he'd drawn an arrow pointing north with a small N beside it. The arrow on the rock in front of us was drawn in the same hand. Same proportions, same slight curve at the tip of the head, where the stroke changed direction. I marked that observation in my notebook and radioed Ortiz. I described what we'd found, gave coordinates, and told him I wanted to continue following the drainage. He acknowledged and told me the morning search teams had deployed to sectors north of the crest, nowhere near our position. We were alone down here. Dana and I continued descending. Over the next hour, we found 3 more arrows. Each one was drawn on the left wall of the drainage, at the same height, 54 inches, in the same charcoal medium with the same hand. Each one pointed deeper. The spacing between them was remarkably consistent, roughly 180 to 200 meters apart, as if whoever was drawing them understood that the next arrow needed to be visible from the last one's position, accounting for the curves and obstructions of the drainage. That kind of spatial planning was unusual in a 12-year-old. Not impossible, but unusual. I photographed and GPS marked each one. I was building a track log on the unit, watching the elevation drop. We were below 8,000 feet now. The vegetation thickening, the drainage widening into something more like a narrow canyon. The snowmelt trickle had grown into a small stream, maybe 6 inches across, running clear over pale granite. Between the third and fourth arrows, I noticed something else. The stream was warm, not dramatically, not steaming. But when I crouched to fill my water bottle from it and my fingers dipped into the flow, the temperature was noticeably above what snowmelt should have been at this elevation in March. I held my hand in the stream for several seconds to be sure. The water felt like it had been sitting in the sun for hours, except we were in deep shade. And it was 7:50 in the morning, and the stream was fed by snowpack less than 1,000 feet uphill. I didn't mention it to Dana. I noted it in my book and kept walking. The fourth arrow was different from the others. It was drawn at the same height, in the same charcoal, with the same hand. But beside it to the right, separated by about 6 inches, there was a second mark. Not an arrow, a circle, roughly 4 inches in diameter. And inside the circle, a smaller circle. And inside that, a dot. I stared at it. The concentric pattern was precise, not mechanically perfect, but drawn with enough care that the circles were recognizably concentric rather than random. It looked like a target, or an eye, or a diagram of something I didn't have context for. Dana was standing beside me. She was looking at the circle pattern with an expression I couldn't read. I asked her if she recognized it. She said, "Caleb draws that. He draws it all the time, on his notebooks, on his homework, in the margins of his books." I asked her what it meant. She said she'd asked him once, and he'd told her it was what the mountain looked like from above. The outer circle was the base. The inner circle was the tree line. The dot was the summit. A topographic portrait. A 12-year-old's contour map reduced to its simplest expression. I looked at the symbol again. On a wall of granite, 500 feet down, a drainage that no search team had entered, drawn in charcoal at the exact height of a missing boy's eyes. I felt the same thing I'd felt in the saddle the day before. Not fear, not yet, but the specific discomfort of evidence that fits together in a way that shouldn't be possible. Because I was now tracking the math in my head, and the math was wrong. Caleb had been missing for 7 days. The charcoal marks were fresh, no weathering, no water damage despite the stream running along the drainage floor. The first arrow was 500 feet below a saddle that had been searched extensively, in terrain that no team had entered, but that was directly accessible from the trail. It was plausible that Caleb had descended into the drainage on the first day and drawn the arrows as a way to mark his route. But the arrows were pointing down, into the drainage, away from the trail, away from help, away from everything a lost child should move toward. If he'd been trying to mark a return route, the arrows should have pointed up, back toward the saddle, back toward the trail he knew. These arrows were not marks of retreat. They were marks of invitation. I radioed Ortiz and reported the arrow series and the symbol. I gave him the GPS track and told him we were at approximately 7,600 feet and still descending. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he told me something that changed the shape of the day. He said that 30 minutes ago, one of the maintenance search teams working a sector north of the crest had found something on the crest trail. A small cairn, 5 stones, carefully stacked, that had not been there yesterday. Beneath the top stone, folded into a tight square, was a piece of paper torn from a ruled composition notebook. On the paper, in pencil, in a child's handwriting, was a single sentence. "She's coming." I stood in that drainage and listened to Ortiz read the sentence twice. The radio hissed softly in the silence between his words. I asked who had found it. He said a SAR volunteer named Pruitt, a retired school teacher who had been on the search since day 2. Pruitt was experienced, reliable, and visibly shaken. He'd walked that section of the Crest Trail 45 minutes before finding the cairn, and it had not been there. I asked if the handwriting had been compared to any known samples of Caleb's. Ortiz said Dana had provided a school notebook during the initial investigation. The writing on the note was consistent in size, slant, and letter formation with Caleb's homework samples. He said the forensic comparison was informal, just a side-by-side look, but the SAR team leader who made the comparison said he'd bet his pension it was the same hand. "She's coming." Dana was watching me. She couldn't hear the radio clearly at my distance. I'd stepped away when Ortiz called. But she could read my posture. I have never been good at hiding operational concern. It's one of the reasons I spent most of my career in the backcountry rather than in administrative roles. I walked back to her and told her what they'd found. I read her the sentence. I watched her face. She didn't react the way I expected. There was no gasp, no tears, no rush of desperate hope. Instead, something settled behind her eyes, a confirmation of something she'd already been carrying. She said, "He knows I'm looking." I said it appeared that way. She said, "He's leaving these for me. The shoe, the wrapper, the bottle, the arrows. He's leaving them for me because he knows I'm the one who'll come." I said the evidence was consistent with that interpretation, and I meant it. But I also said that we needed to consider the possibility that whoever was placing these items was not Caleb. That someone else might be using Caleb's possessions and imitating his handwriting to draw Dana deeper into the mountain. She looked at me with something that wasn't anger, but was adjacent to it. She said, "Who?" It was a fair question. The FBI's preliminary theory, a third party with psychological motives, required a person. A person who had somehow obtained Caleb's shoe, water bottle, food wrappers, and a sample of his handwriting. A person who could place objects in searched areas without being detected. A person who could draw symbols that only Caleb and his mother would recognize. A person who knew the mountain well enough to operate invisibly across multiple sectors for 7 days. I didn't have an answer. I told her that. She said, "Then we keep going down." I looked at the drainage below us. It continued descending, narrowing again, the stream growing as tributary trickles joined from side fissures in the rock. The vegetation was thicker here. Gamble oak and mountain mahogany encroaching from the walls, reducing visibility. The air was warmer than it should have been, and I noticed that the warmth wasn't coming from the sun, which was above and behind us. It was coming from below, from the drainage itself. I checked the time, 9:45 a.m. We had 2 hours before my check-in deadline with Ortiz. We had water, food, first aid supplies, and a functioning radio, though I'd noticed the signal was weaker down here. The drainage walls were beginning to interfere. I told Dana we'd continue for 1 more hour, then reassess. She was already moving. The 5th arrow appeared 15 minutes later at 7,300 feet. Same wall, same height, same charcoal. But the symbol beside it had changed. Instead of the concentric circles, there was a horizontal line with a series of short vertical marks extending downward from it. 5 marks, evenly spaced. I drew it in my notebook and studied it. Dana said, "A hand." I looked again. She was right. The horizontal line was a palm seen from below. The vertical marks were fingers, a child's drawing of a hand pointing down, an open hand reaching. Below the hand, drawn smaller and with lighter strokes, was another concentric circle, the mountain symbol. Together, The marks read like a simple pictograph, a hand reaching toward the mountain or reaching into it. The stream was warmer now. I tested it again. A rough field estimate put it somewhere in the mid-60s Fahrenheit. That was 30 degrees above what snow melt should be at this elevation. The water wasn't discolored. It didn't smell of sulfur or minerals. It ran clear and clean over granite, except that it was warm in a way that had no geological source I could identify. The Sandayas are not volcanic. They're a fault block range, uplifted Precambrian granite and Paleozoic limestone, tilted west. There are no hot springs in the Sandia Mountains, no geothermal features, no known thermal anomalies in any survey I'd ever seen. I crouched beside the stream and held both hands in it. The warmth was steady, even, pervasive, not like a hot spot where geothermal water enters a surface flow, but as if the entire volume of water had been gently heated from source to surface, as if the rock itself was warm. I placed my palm flat on the dry granite beside the stream. It was warm, not sun-warm. The surface was in full shade. It was warm from within, like a stone that had been sitting beside a fire and was slowly releasing its heat. I moved my hand to another spot. Same warmth. I moved to the opposite wall. Same. The entire drainage was warm. Dana had stopped. She was standing very still, her face turned slightly upward, her eyes half closed. I recognized the expression. I'd seen it before, in different contexts. A tracker catching a scent change on the wind. A climber reading ice before committing to a route. She was sensing something I couldn't detect. She said quietly, "Can you feel that?" I asked her what she was feeling. She struggled with the words. Then she said, "It's like standing next to someone, not seeing them, not hearing them, just knowing they're there because the air is different." I didn't feel it. I felt warm rock and warm water and the growing professional discomfort of being in an uncleared drainage with a civilian whose child was missing, following charcoal arrows drawn by someone I couldn't identify toward a destination I couldn't predict. But I looked at Dana Royce, a woman who had been walking this mountain for 7 straight days, who had found objects that defied rational placement, who had been drawn to this drainage by something she described as a pull. And I made a decision that I've examined many times in the years since. I decided to trust her. Not her interpretation, not her grief, not her hope. I decided to trust the specific, repeated, documented pattern of evidence that organized itself around her presence. The shoe, the wrapper, the bottle, the words scratched in granite, the note on the crest trail, and now the arrows, each one drawn in her son's hand, each one pointing her deeper into a drainage that grew warmer with every step. Whatever was happening in the Sandia Mountains, it was happening in relationship to Dana Royce. She was not a bystander in this search. She was the axis around which every anomalous piece of evidence had appeared. I keyed the radio and called Ortiz. The signal was marginal. His voice broke in and out through static. I told him we were continuing to descend, that we'd found 5 charcoal arrows consistent with Caleb's handwriting, and that the drainage was exhibiting an unexplained thermal anomaly. I told him I wanted a geology consult if he could reach anyone at UNM. And I wanted a second team staged at the saddle above us in case we needed extraction support. His response came through in fragments. I caught copy and geology and be careful. And then the signal dropped. We were functionally alone. Dana looked at me. I looked at the drainage below us, disappearing into a thickening corridor of oak and stone, the warm stream running ahead like a thread laid down for us to follow. I said, "Stay behind me from here." She didn't argue. We continued down. At 7,100 feet, the drainage opened. The narrow cut widened abruptly into a small natural amphitheater, a roughly circular space, perhaps 80 feet across, walled on three sides by granite faces that rose vertically to 40 or 50 feet. The floor was flat, covered in a thin layer of sandy soil over bedrock. The stream entered from the upper end, where we stood, and ran across the floor to the lower end, where it disappeared into a crack in the base of the far wall. The space was warm, noticeably, immediately warm. I estimated the air temperature at 70 degrees 40 degrees above the ambient temperature at this elevation on a March morning. The granite walls radiated heat like the walls of a room with a fire in it. The soil under my boots felt alive, though I didn't know what I meant by that at the time. It just felt different, responsive somehow, like walking on something that was aware of the weight. The amphitheater floor was covered in drawings, not charcoal, something darker, more permanent, a pigment that looked almost like ink, applied to the sandy surface in lines and curves and symbols that covered every visible inch of ground that the stream didn't cross. The drawings were dense, layered, complex. Some were recognizable arrows, concentric circles, handprints, stick figures. Others were abstract spirals, branching patterns, grids of dots, wave-like lines that flowed across the floor in patterns that seemed almost mathematical. In the center of the floor, drawn larger than anything else, was a figure. It was a human shape, child-sized, drawn in outline only, arms extended to the sides, legs together, like a snow angel or a gingerbread man. The figure was surrounded by concentric circles, dozens of them, radiating outward from the body like ripples in water, each circle drawn with a steadiness that seemed impossible by hand. Around the outer edge of the ripples, spaced evenly, were words, written in the same careful child's handwriting I'd been following down the drainage. I walked to the edge of the drawings and crouched down. I read the words aloud, moving clockwise around the figure. I'm okay. It's warm. I can hear everything. The mountain is awake. Tell Mom I'm okay. She's coming. I knew she would. Dana was standing at the entrance to the amphitheater. She hadn't moved. She was reading the words from where she stood, and her face had gone very still, not collapsed, not blank. Still in the way that deep water is still everything happening below the surface. She said his name. Once. Quietly. Not a shout. Not a call for rescue. She said Caleb, the way you say someone's name when you can feel them in the room but can't see them. And the ground answered. Not a sound. Not a vibration I could hear or feel through my boots. But the thin layer of sandy soil across the amphitheater floor shifted. Gently, as if something beneath it had exhaled. The drawings didn't blur or distort. The soil moved uniformly, a millimeter at most, settling and then resettling, the way the surface of a sleeping body moves with breath. I stood up. I stepped back off the drawing-covered ground onto bare rock. My pulse was elevated and my hands were steady, which is a combination that usually means my training is running ahead of my emotions, keeping me functional while the rest of me catches up. Dana walked into the amphitheater. I said her name. I said it with the specific calm authority that I'd spent 40 years learning, the voice that tells a person you are not panicking, but you need them to stop. She didn't stop. She walked to the center of the floor, to the child-sized figure drawn in the soil, and she knelt down beside it. She placed both hands flat on the ground, one on each side of the figure's chest, and she leaned forward until her face was close to the earth. She said, I'm here. The ground shifted again, stronger this time. A slow, deliberate pulse that I could feel through the soles of my boots from 10 feet away. The warmth intensified, not uncomfortably, not dramatically, but the way a room warms when another person enters it. The stream running across the far edge of the amphitheater changed pitch, its sound deepening slightly, as if the rock beneath it had adjusted. And then, and I need to describe this precisely, because I've been asked about it many times, and precision is the only thing I have to offer. The soil beneath Dana's right hand moved. Not shifted, moved. It rose, approximately 1 inch, in the shape of a small hand pressing up from below. 5 fingers and a palm, pushing the sandy surface upward from beneath the bedrock floor of the amphitheater, in the exact space where Dana's hand was resting. Dana made a sound. Not a scream, not a word, a sound that came from a place in her body that language hasn't reached. She pressed her hand down against the shape, and it pressed back. She held that position for what my watch later told me was 90 seconds. It felt like a different unit of time entirely. She was kneeling on the warm soil, with her right hand pressed against that small upward pressure. And her left hand had moved to cover her mouth, and her shoulders were shaking. And she was silent, completely silent. Whatever was moving through her was too large for sound. I did not approach. I did not intervene. I stood on the bare rock at the edge of the amphitheater with my hand on my radio, and my training telling me 6 different things I should be doing. And I did none of them. Because every protocol I possessed was built for situations where the danger was identifiable, and the correct response was action. And this was neither. This was a mother kneeling on warm ground with something pressing back against her palm from inside the earth. And every piece of evidence I had collected over the past 2 days pointed to the same impossible conclusion. And I was not prepared to interrupt it. The small hand shape beneath the soil held its form for the full 90 seconds. It didn't shift or waver. It pressed upward with what appeared to be gentle, steady, deliberate force enough to dimple the surface and hold Dana's hand, but not enough to breach it. Like something reaching toward a boundary it understood it couldn't cross. Then it subsided. Slowly. The soil settled flat again, grain by grain. The impression smoothing itself out until the surface was indistinguishable from the ground around it. Dana stayed where she was. Her hand remained on the spot. She was breathing in long, controlled draws, the way someone breathes when they're trying to stay present inside an experience that wants to pull them under. I gave her time. After perhaps 2 minutes, she lifted her hand and looked at it. The palm was clean. No soil clung to it, which struck me as wrong. She'd been pressing into sandy dirt with enough force to leave an impression, and her skin should have been dusty. It wasn't. Her hand looked like she'd just washed it. She stood up. She turned to face me. Her eyes were clear, not tearful, not distant, not ecstatic. Clear in a way that I associate with people who have just received information they've been waiting for and are now processing its weight. She said, "He's here." I said I could see that the evidence supported that conclusion, and that we needed to contact Ortiz and get a team down here with ground-penetrating radar and a geologist before we did anything else. She shook her head, not in refusal, in correction. "You don't understand," she said. "He's not trapped. He's not buried. He's here. He's part of it." I asked her what she meant by it. She looked at the ground beneath her feet, at the drawings, the arrows, the circles, the child-shaped figure with its radiating rings, the words written in her son's hand. She looked at the walls of the amphitheater, which I now noticed were also warm to the touch and faintly moist, a thin film of condensation catching the light that filtered down from the open sky above. She looked at the stream, which had resumed its normal pitch but was still running warm, still clear, still carrying that impossible thermal signature down through the drainage. She said, "The mountain." Then she said, "Caleb told me last year that he thought the mountain was alive." I told him that was a beautiful thought. He said it wasn't a thought. He said he could feel it when he sat at the rock garden. He said it felt like sitting next to a very old, very patient person who didn't need to talk. She paused. I thought he was being poetic. He was 12. 12-year-olds say things like that. I didn't realize he was being literal. I looked at the amphitheater around us, at the thermal anomaly that shouldn't exist, at the drawings on the ground that had been made by a child who had been missing for 7 days in a drainage that no search team had entered, at the soil that had responded to a mother's touch by pressing back in the shape of a child's hand. I had been in the field for nearly 4 decades. I had encountered things I couldn't explain, sounds in places where sounds had no source, animal behavior that contradicted everything biology predicted, equipment failures that were too precise to be mechanical. I had developed, over those years, a professional tolerance for the unexplained. I didn't need everything to make sense. I needed it to be safe. And standing in that amphitheater, I did not feel unsafe. That was the part that troubled me. The warmth was gentle. The ground's movement had been gentle. The hand shape had been gentle. Everything about this space communicated something closer to welcome than threat. And I distrusted that, because in my experience, the wilderness does not welcome. It permits. It tolerates. It is indifferent. Welcome is a human concept, and whatever was happening beneath this drainage was not human. I told Dana I needed 15 minutes to document the space. She nodded and sat down on a flat boulder near the stream, her hand trailing in the warm water, her eyes unfocused. I worked methodically. I photographed the drawings from multiple angles, including close-ups of the text. I measured the amphitheater roughly 82 feet at its widest, 67 feet at its narrowest, walls between 38 and 52 feet high. I tested the stream temperature by holding my hand in it and counting. I estimated mid to upper 60s, consistent with what I'd measured upstream. I tested the rock walls warm, uniformly, with no hot spots or gradients. I tested the soil warm, fine-grained, sandy, with a loamy organic quality that seemed out of place over granite bedrock. I tried the radio. Nothing. Not static, not fragments. The signal was completely dead. The drainage walls, combined with our depth below the ridge, had put us in a radio shadow. I noted that in my book with a single underline, which in my personal shorthand means a fact that changes operational planning. We had no communication with base camp. Ortiz expected a check-in by noon. It was now 11:15 a.m. If we started climbing immediately, we could reach the saddle and radio range within an hour. If we stayed, we'd miss the check-in, and Ortiz would deploy a team to our last known position, which was over 1,000 feet above us in a drainage they'd never entered. I told Dana we needed to start back. She looked at me, not with resistance, with something more like disbelief that the normal world still had claims on us. "We have no radio," I said. "Search Command doesn't know where we are. If we miss our check-in, they'll send people into this drainage without preparation or context. And I don't want anyone entering this space without understanding what's here." That reached her. She was a mother, and her instinct was to stay as close to her child as the earth would allow. But she was also an intelligent woman who understood that what we'd found required more than 2 people and a notebook. She stood up. She looked at the ground one more time, at the child-shaped figure, at the words written around it in concentric rings. at the spot where the small hand had pressed up against hers. She said, "I'll come back." She wasn't talking to me. The climb out of the drainage took longer than the descent. The warm air below gave way to the cold March wind above, and the transition was abrupt. Within 200 vertical feet, the rock under my hands went from warm to cold, and my breath was visible again. Dana climbed steadily without speaking. I followed, watching the charcoal arrows pass on our left, each one pointing down toward the place we'd just been. We reached the saddle at 12:20 p.m. I immediately keyed the radio and raised Ortiz. His voice came through clearly, tight with controlled concern. We were 20 minutes overdue. I told him we were safe. I told him we'd found significant physical evidence in the drainage, including a large ground-level display of drawings and writing consistent with Caleb Royce's known handwriting and artistic habits. I told him the drainage exhibited a thermal anomaly that warranted geological assessment. I told him I would brief him fully at base camp, and that I recommended no personnel enter the drainage until I'd done so. He copied all of it. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "Ashcroft, we found two more." 2 more notes, both found within the past hour, both on the crest trail, north of the saddle, in sectors that morning teams had already cleared. The first was tucked into a crack in a trailside boulder. Same ruled notebook paper, same pencil, same handwriting. It read, "She found me." The second was weighted under a stone on the trail itself, in the center of the path, impossible to miss. It read, "Please don't dig." I reached base camp at 1:45 p.m. Dana walked with me to the parking area and then went to her car without coming to the command tent. She said she needed to sit for a while. I told her I'd find her before end of day. She nodded and closed her door. And through the window, I could see her sitting behind the wheel with her hands in her lap, staring at the mountain. In the command tent, Ortiz had the evidence laid out on the folding table. The 2 new notes, each in a clear plastic bag. The original note from that morning. Photographs of the cairn where each had been found. GPS coordinates. Timestamps. Also at the table was a woman I hadn't met, early 50s. Short gray hair, wireframe glasses, wearing a UNM windbreaker, and an expression of professional skepticism that I recognized because I'd worn it myself for most of the day. Ortiz introduced her as Dr. Ruth Kessler, a geologist from the university's Earth and Planetary Sciences department. She'd come up within 2 hours of his request, which told me either the Sandias were part of her research area or she'd been following the search in the news and was already interested. Ortiz asked me to brief them both. I did. Starting from the drainage entrance, I described everything in sequence. The arrows, their spacing, their height, the associated symbols, the warming stream, the warming rock, the amphitheater, the drawings, the child-shaped figure, the words, the soil movement, and the hand shape that had pressed up beneath Dana's palm. I described it the way I'm describing it now. Without interpretation, without theory, just the observations, in order, with measurements where I had them and honest uncertainty where I didn't. When I finished, Ortiz was leaning back in his chair with his arms folded, looking at the map on the wall. Dr. Kessler had been taking notes on a yellow legal pad. She'd filled 2 pages. She spoke first. "The thermal anomaly, did you observe any sulfur odor, any mineral discoloration in the stream, any gas bubbles, any steam?" "No" to all 4. "And the soil in the amphitheater? You described it as sandy with organic content, over granite bedrock." "Correct. There shouldn't be significant soil development over bare granite in a drainage at that elevation, especially not with organic content. A drainage that's steep and narrow would scour to bedrock seasonally." I agreed. and the rock walls were uniformly warm. No gradient, no point source. That was my observation. She set her pen down. The Sandias have no geothermal activity. None. The granite is Precambrian. 1.4 billion years old, thermally inert. No magmatic history within any relevant time frame. There's no mechanism I can propose for uniform rock warming in a localized drainage without a heat source. I asked her if she wanted to go down and see it. She said yes, immediately. She wanted to go that afternoon. Ortiz intervened. He said no one was going into the drainage today. He said he needed to process the new evidence, consult with the SAR team leaders, and make a decision about how to proceed. He also said, and his voice was careful when he said it, that one of the notes found that morning specifically requested that no one dig. Dr. Kessler looked at him. Sergeant, you're not suggesting we modify a search and rescue operation based on a note allegedly written by the missing subject? Ortiz didn't answer immediately. He reached across the table and picked up the plastic bag containing the second note. He held it up so she could read it. Please don't dig. He said, Dr. Kessler, I've been on this mountain for 7 days. I have 16 years in law enforcement and 9 years running search operations. I have never, in any search, had physical evidence appear in cleared areas, written in a missing child's handwriting, specifically addressing the actions of the search team. I am not suggesting we stop looking for this boy. I am suggesting that whatever is happening deserves more than an afternoon scramble into an undocumented drainage with unknown conditions. Kessler held his gaze. Then she sat back. She said, Tomorrow morning, then. First light. I want a full field kit thermocouples, a portable spectrometer, sample containers, and a camera with macro capability. And I want to see that amphitheater before anyone else enters it. Ortiz looked at me. I said I'd guide her down. I said I wanted Donna with us. That produced a silence. Ortiz said, She's a civilian. She's the mother of the missing subject. She's emotionally involved in a way that compromises. I stopped him. I told him that every piece of evidence in this case had appeared in proximity to Dana Royce or in direct response to her presence. The arrows were at her son's eye level. The notes referenced her. The soil had responded to her touch. If there was a pattern, and I believe there was, then Dana was part of it. And excluding her might mean excluding the mechanism by which evidence was being generated. I told him I wasn't asking as a sentimentalist. I was asking as someone who had spent 40 years reading evidence patterns. And this one had Dana Royce at its center. Ortiz thought about it for a long time. Then he said, She's your responsibility. I accepted that. That evening, I sat in my motel room in Tijeras, a small community just south of Sandia Park on the east side of the range, and spread my notes across the bed. Photographs printed at the motel office. GPS coordinates transcribed from the unit. A hand-drawn map of the drainage with the arrow locations marked. My temperature estimates. My description of the amphitheater, the drawings, the words, the hand. I also had the case file Lena Seward had sent me, now augmented with Ortiz's daily logs and the evidence inventory. I laid it all out and looked at it the way I'd look at a search board, not for answers, but for the shape of the question. The evidence fell into 2 categories. The first category was the trail evidence objects and notes found on established trails in previously searched areas, appearing after search teams had cleared those areas. The shoe, the wrapper, the bottle, the cairn notes. These items appeared in public space, where anyone could find them, but Dana had found most of them first. They were addressed to her directly or referenced her indirectly. They appeared to be placed with deliberate timing, each one arriving after a search team had passed, but before Dana arrived, as if something knew both schedules. The second category was the drainage evidence. The arrows, the symbols, the amphitheater, the drawings, the thermal anomaly, the soil response. This evidence existed in a space no one had entered before Dana and I descended that morning. It was not placed for discovery by a search team. It was placed or created for Donna specifically, along a route that only she would take, guided by something she described as a pull that operated only when she was alone. The two categories didn't contradict each other, but they implied different capabilities. The trail evidence required knowledge of search team movements and an ability to place physical objects in specific locations without being observed. The drainage evidence required the ability to draw on stone and soil, maintain an impossible thermal environment, and produce a physical response. The hand shape from within solid rock. I sat on that motel bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to construct a scenario in which a human being, an abductor, a hoaxer, a disturbed individual, could account for all of it. I tried for over an hour. I could not make it work. The trail evidence, taken alone, was theoretically possible to stage. Difficult, but possible. Someone who knew the mountain, who monitored the search teams, who had access to Caleb's belongings and could imitate his handwriting. That person could, with extraordinary effort and risk, place objects on the trail between search sweeps. But the drainage evidence was not stageable. The thermal anomaly was real. I had felt it in my hands, in the soles of my boots, in the air against my face. Dr. Kessler, a geologist who studies rock for a living, had no explanation for it. The soil response, the hand shape pressing up from below bedrock, was not something a person could produce from inside granite, which left two possibilities. Either my observations were unreliable, I had been deceived by my senses, influenced by the emotional intensity of the situation, and had seen things that didn't happen the way I recorded them. Or the mountain was doing something that I had no framework to understand, and a 12-year-old boy was at the center of it. I did not sleep well that night. The next morning, Thursday, day 8 of the search, I was at the trailhead at 5:50 a.m. Dr. Kessler was already there, loading a pack that looked like it weighed 40 pounds. She had thermocouples, a handheld spectrometer, sample bags, a geological hammer, a camera, and a Brunton compass. She was dressed for serious field work, and she moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades going into hard places to measure things that other people only talked about. Dana arrived at 6:05 a.m. She looked like she hadn't slept either, but her eyes were focused and her pack was ready. She nodded to me. She looked at Kessler with brief appraisal, the way you look at a stranger who is about to enter something private with you. I introduced them. Kessler shook Dana's hand and said, "I'm here to measure what's in that drainage. I understand this is personal for you. I'll do my best to be respectful, but I need access to everything, and I need to take samples." Donna said, "I understand." We started up. The hike to the saddle took just over 90 minutes. Kessler was fit. She kept pace without complaint, though I could tell the altitude was working on her by the time we crossed 9,000 feet. At the saddle, I pointed into the drainage and described the route. Kessler studied the terrain with binoculars, then folded them away and said, "Lead." We descended. The first arrow appeared on schedule, the charcoal mark on the left wall, shaft and angled head at 54 inches. Kessler examined it closely. She took a sample of the charcoal with a swab and sealed it. She measured the mark's dimensions and photographed it with a scale bar. She said, "This is wood charcoal, consistent with a burned stick. The application pressure is light a child or small adult." She paused. "It's fresh. Days, not weeks." We moved to the second arrow, the third, the fourth, with its concentric circle symbol. Kessler sampled and documented each one. At the fourth, she spent several minutes studying the concentric circles. She asked Dana what they meant. Dana explained the mountain from above. Kessler didn't comment on the interpretation. She photographed the symbol and moved on. Between the fourth and fifth arrows, she noticed the stream temperature. She stopped, crouched, and placed a thermocouple probe directly into the water. She watched the reading stabilize. 68.4 Fahrenheit, she said. She looked at me. "You said mid-60s yesterday." I nodded. "It's warmer today." She moved the probe upstream, took another reading. 69.1. She moved it again. 69.6. The temperature is increasing as we ascend toward the source, which is snowmelt. She stared at the probe reading for a long time. She said, "This should not be possible." She took a water sample, sealed it, and labeled it with the GPS coordinates and temperature. Then she placed her bare hand on the dry rock beside the stream, the way I had done the day before. Her expression changed. It was subtle. Kessler was not a person who displayed surprise easily, but I saw it. The slight widening of the eyes, the momentary stillness. "The rock is warm," she said. I told her it had been warm yesterday as well. She took the thermocouple and pressed it against the granite surface. 72 degrees. Surface temperature of shaded granite at 7,800 feet in March. She moved the probe. 73, 74. She looked up at me. The gradient is increasing with depth into the drainage. The heat source is below us. We continued down. At the fifth arrow, the one with the hand symbol, Kessler stopped and studied the drawing for a full minute without speaking. She swabbed the charcoal. She measured the hand symbol's proportions. Then she said, "The hand is anatomically accurate. 5 fingers, correct proportional spacing. The thumb offset at the appropriate angle. A child who draws a hand typically makes 5 lines of equal length radiating from a horizontal bar. This hand has differentiated finger lengths. The ring finger is shorter than the middle finger. The pinky is significantly shorter. Whoever drew this was either copying a real hand or had an unusually developed understanding of anatomy for a 12-year-old. Dana said, "Caleb draws a lot. He draws hands all the time. He told me once they were the hardest thing to get right." Kessler looked at her. Something shifted in the geologist's expression, not sympathy exactly, but the beginning of a recognition that this case was not going to remain inside her professional boundaries. We reached the amphitheater at 10:30 a.m. Kessler stopped at the entrance. She stood absolutely still, the way I'd seen her stand when the rock temperature first registered. But this was a longer stillness. She was looking at the drawings on the ground, the child-shaped figure, the concentric rings, the words written in a careful child's hand. She read the words aloud, slowly. "I'm okay. It's warm. I can hear everything. The mountain is awake. Tell Mom I'm okay. She's coming. I knew she would." She turned to me. Her professional skepticism was still there. I could see it in the set of her jaw and the precise way she held herself, but it was now coexisting with something else. An uncertainty that I recognized because I'd been carrying it myself since the hand shape pressed up beneath Dana's palm. She said, "How long have these been here?" I told her I didn't know. I told her they were here when Dana and I arrived yesterday. and that the charcoal and pigment appeared fresh. She crouched at the edge of the drawings. She touched the dark pigment on the soil surface. She rubbed it between her fingers. "This isn't charcoal," she said. "It's mineral. Some kind of oxide, iron maybe, or manganese." She took a sample. Then she pressed her thermocouple into the soil. 81 degrees, she said quietly. She moved the probe. 83, 85 at the center. She looked up. "The heat is concentrated under the figure." Dana had entered the amphitheater. She was standing near the center, not on the figure itself, but close. She was looking at the ground with the same expression she'd worn yesterday, the deep water stillness, the inward listening. Kessler worked for the next 40 minutes. She measured temperatures at 32 points across the amphitheater floor, creating a grid in her notebook. She took 6 soil samples. She measured the wall's temperature, mineral composition by spectrometer, moisture content. She sampled the stream at 3 points where it crossed the space. She photographed everything with the methodical thoroughness of someone building a data set that would have to survive peer review. At one point, she stopped measuring and simply stood in the middle of the amphitheater with her instruments at her sides, looking at the walls, the sky, the ground. She was feeling the warmth. I could see it in her body, the way her shoulders had dropped, the way her breathing had slowed. The space did that to you. It was warm and enclosed and quiet, and it invited you to stop working and simply be present. She caught herself. She lifted the thermocouple and resumed measuring. But I'd seen the pause. At 11:15 a.m., Dana said, "Something's different." Kessler and I both looked at her. Dana was standing near the child-shaped figure, her head tilted slightly, her eyes focused on the ground, but not on any specific feature. She was listening. Not with her ears, I could see that. With whatever sense had guided her into this drainage in the first place. She said, "Yesterday the ground moved when I touched it. You saw that." I confirmed. She said, "Right now it's doing something else. I can feel it in my feet. It's not movement. It's more like..." She searched for the word. Attention. Kessler had her thermocouple in the soil 3 feet from where Dana was standing. She looked at the reading. Then she looked at it again. She said, "The temperature just rose 4 degrees. She moved the probe to a point equidistant from Dana on the opposite side. Same. 4-degree increase in the last 90 seconds. She looked at Dana. "Since you said something." She moved the probe to the far edge of the amphitheater, near the wall, well away from Dana. No change here. The temperature increase is localized around you. Dana looked at her. Then she looked at me. She said, "He knows I'm here." Kessler opened her mouth to object, to propose an alternative, to do what scientists do when someone makes a claim that exceeds the evidence. But she stopped. She looked at her thermocouple. She looked at the readings she'd been collecting for 40 minutes. She looked at the warm rock and the warm soil and the warm water running through a granite drainage that had no business being warm. She didn't say anything. Dana knelt. She placed her hand on the soil beside the child-shaped figure, in the same spot where the hand had pressed upward yesterday. She pressed down gently. The response came faster this time. The soil rose beneath her palm. Same shape, 5 fingers, a palm, pressing upward with steady, deliberate, gentle force. But there was something different. Yesterday, the hand had been still, holding its shape for 90 seconds and then subsiding. Today it moved. The fingers curled, slowly, individually, with the hesitant precision of someone learning a gesture for the first time. The small earthen fingers curled inward and wrapped around Dana's hand from below, not gripping, holding, the way a child holds a parent's hand not to restrain, but to maintain contact. Dana was crying. Silently, completely, without wiping her eyes or pulling her hand away. She held still and let the hand hold hers, and she wept in the warm amphitheater at the bottom of a drainage that shouldn't exist, in a mountain that was doing something no one could explain. Kessler was recording. She had her camera aimed at Dana's hand from 3 feet away, shooting continuous frames, documenting the soil movement with the same precision she'd applied to every measurement that morning. Her hands were shaking. The camera was shaking. But she didn't stop. I stood at the edge and watched, and I felt the ground beneath my own boots pulse once, gently, like a heartbeat, and then go still. The hand held Dana's for 2 full minutes. Then the fingers uncurled, slowly, and the shape subsided into the soil, and the surface was smooth again. Dana stayed kneeling. She pressed her forehead to the ground and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then she stood up, and her face was different. Not broken, not elated, resolved. She had received something, confirmation, contact, whatever word applies to what happens when a mother reaches through stone and her child reaches back. And it had settled her in a way that nothing else on this mountain had. She looked at me and said, "He's not lost." She said it again, quieter. "He's not lost. He's not in danger. He's somewhere I can't go. And he's okay." I didn't respond immediately. I was watching Kessler, who had lowered her camera and was standing motionless, staring at the spot where the hand had been. The geologist's face held an expression I'd seen maybe 5 times in my career, always on someone who had just encountered something that invalidated a core assumption they'd been building their professional life around. It's not shock exactly. It's the moment before the mind decides whether to integrate new information or reject it. Kessler integrated it. She crouched down and pressed her thermocouple into the exact spot where the hand had formed. She watched the reading. 96.8 degrees, she said. Her voice was flat, clinical, the voice of someone using procedure as a guardrail. That is human body temperature. The soil at this specific point is at 96.8 degrees Fahrenheit. She moved the probe 6 inches to the left. 84. 6 inches to the right. 83. Back to the center. 96.6. Dropping slowly. She looked up at me. The thermal signature of the hand shape is consistent with contact from a living human body at normal core temperature, except the contact came from below a granite bedrock floor. She took a soil sample from the hand location, sealed it, and labeled it with her coordinates, the time and the temperature reading. Her handwriting on the label was steady. Whatever she was feeling, her training held. She stood up and walked to the far wall of the amphitheater. She placed her spectrometer against the granite and took a reading. Then another, at a different spot. Then another. She said, "The mineral composition of these walls is consistent with the Sandia granite Precambrian, predominantly quartz and feldspar, with biotite inclusions. There's nothing anomalous about the rock itself." She paused. "The heat is not coming from the rock. It's coming through the rock. Something beneath or within the formation is generating thermal energy, and the granite is conducting it." I asked her how deep the heat source might be. She said she couldn't determine that without more sophisticated equipment. Ground-penetrating radar would help. Seismic survey would be better. But based on the thermal gradient she'd measured from the drainage entrance to the amphitheater temperature increasing with depth and distance into the formation, she estimated the source was not shallow. Tens of meters at minimum, possibly much deeper. I asked her what geological process could produce a localized thermal anomaly of this magnitude in thermally inert Precambrian granite with no volcanic or geothermal history. She said, "None that I know of." I asked her what biological process could produce a hand-shaped thermal impression at human body temperature through solid bedrock. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm a geologist. That question is outside my discipline. But I'll tell you what I observed. I observed soil displacement in a pattern consistent with a human hand, generated from below a surface that my instruments tell me is solid granite. And I observed a thermal reading at the contact point that matches living human tissue. I recorded both observations. What I cannot do is explain them." That was honest. I respected it. I checked the time. Nearly noon. We'd been in the amphitheater for an hour and a half. We had no radio contact. We were deep in an undocumented drainage. And we had a civilian with us who had just experienced something that no debrief protocol was designed to address. I told both of them we needed to return to the surface. Donna nodded. She was calm, genuinely calm, not performing calm. Whatever the contact had given her, it had landed somewhere deep and stable. She shouldered her pack and looked at the amphitheater one last time, the way you look at a room where something important happened, memorizing it because you know you might not see it again. Kessler packed her instruments with the same methodical care she'd unpacked them. She sealed her sample bags. She stowed her camera. But before she left the amphitheater, she did something that surprised me. She walked to the center of the floor, to the child-shaped figure, and she crouched down and placed her own hand flat on the soil, in a spot several feet from where Dana had made contact. She held it there for 10 seconds. 20, 30. Nothing happened. The soil didn't move. The temperature didn't spike. The ground lay quiet and warm and still beneath a geologist's palm. She stood up. Her expression was unreadable. She walked to the drainage entrance and started climbing without a word. I noted that. The drainage responded to Dana. It did not respond to Kessler. Whatever mechanism was operating here, and I use that word loosely, because mechanism implies a process I can describe, it was selective. It recognized who was reaching. We reached the saddle at 1:40 p.m. The wind was sharp after the warmth of the drainage, and all three of us paused to pull on layers. I raised Ortiz on the radio and gave him a brief summary. We'd revisited the amphitheater, collected samples and measurements, observed additional thermal anomalies, and were returning to base camp. I told him Kessler would need to brief him on the geological findings. He copied. Then he said, "Ashcroft, I need you down here. We have a development." I asked him what kind. He said the FBI had sent a field agent. She'd arrived that morning. She wanted to interview Dana, and she wanted to review all evidence collected to date, including anything from the drainage. I told him we'd be down within the hour. The hike to the trailhead was quiet. Kessler walked ahead, moving fast, her mind visibly working behind her eyes. Dana walked steadily, at her own pace, unbothered by the news about the FBI. I walked between them and thought about what I was going to say to a federal agent about soil that moved in the shape of a child's hand. The FBI agent's name was Supervisory Special Agent Carmen Reyes, out of the Albuquerque field office. She was in her mid-40s, compact, dark-haired, wearing field-appropriate clothing and an expression that communicated two things, simultaneously professional courtesy and absolute control of the conversation she was about to have. She'd set up in the command tent with Ortiz's evidence table reorganized to her specifications, every item bagged, tagged, and arranged chronologically. She had a laptop open, a digital recorder, and a legal pad with notes already covering 3 pages. She shook my hand. She introduced herself. She told me she'd been assigned to the case after the 3rd note was found, which elevated the Bureau's assessment from monitoring to active investigation. She said her working theory was that a person or persons were placing objects and messages on the mountain to manipulate the search, potentially as part of a custody-related interference or a psychologically motivated abduction. I told her I'd spent 2 days on the mountain, and I didn't think that theory accounted for what we'd found. She said she'd like to hear what we'd found. I briefed her, the same way I'd briefed Ortiz and Kessler, sequential, observational, precise. The arrows, the symbols, the thermal anomaly, the amphitheater, the drawings and the words, the soil movement, the hand. Reyes listened without interrupting. She took notes. Her face betrayed nothing. When I finished, she said, "You're describing a scenario in which a 12-year-old boy is somehow alive inside the geological structure of the mountain, communicating with his mother through physical contact transmitted through granite bedrock." I said that was one interpretation of the evidence. She said, "What's another?" I said I didn't have one that fit the data better. She turned to Kessler, who had been sitting in the corner of the tent with her sample bags at her feet, waiting. Reyes said, "Dr. Kessler, do you have a geological explanation for the thermal anomaly?" Kessler said, "No." "Do you have a geological explanation for soil displacement through solid granite?" "No." "Do you believe the observations Mr. Ashcroft has described are accurate?" Kessler straightened. "I believe my own observations. I was present for the 2nd contact event. I recorded it on camera. I measured the thermal signature of the contact point at 96.8 degrees Fahrenheit, consistent with living human tissue. I measured a thermal gradient in the drainage that increases with depth and has no geological source I can identify. I collected samples that I will analyze at my lab. I do not have an explanation for what I observed. But I did observe it, and my instruments confirmed it." Reyes studied her for a moment. Then she turned back to me. "I'd like to interview Ms. Royce." I said I'd ask Dana if she was willing. Reyes said, "She's not a suspect, she's a witness, and she may also be a victim. I'm trying to determine which." I found Dana sitting in her car in the parking area. She'd eaten something. There was a wrapper on the passenger seat, and she was looking at a photograph on her phone. I could see from the angle that it was a picture of Caleb. School portrait maybe, blue background, a boy with dark hair and serious eyes looking directly into the camera with an expression that I could only describe as patient. I told her about Agent Reyes. I told her she wasn't obligated to talk to the FBI. I told her that if she did, she should describe only what she'd experienced, without interpretation, without theory. Just what happened. She said, "I know what happened." I said that was exactly what Reyes needed to hear. Dana met with Reyes for 2 hours. I wasn't present for the interview. Reyes conducted it privately, but afterward, Ortiz told me that Dana had been composed, detailed, and unwavering. She described the pull, the discoveries, the amphitheater, the hand. She'd answered every question directly. She hadn't cried. She hadn't speculated. She'd simply told the agent what she'd experienced. Reyes came out of the interview and stood in the parking area for a few minutes, looking at the mountain. Then she came to find me. She said, "Ms. Royce is either telling the truth or she's the most disciplined liar I've ever interviewed. Her account is internally consistent across 2 hours of questioning. Her physiological indicators as breathing, eye movement, speech cadence are consistent with truthful recall, not fabrication. And her description of the events in the drainage matches your account in every detail, including details she would have no reason to fabricate because they don't support any theory that benefits her. I asked her what she planned to do. She said, "My mandate is to determine whether a crime has been committed. If a person abducted this boy, I will find that person. But if no person is responsible..." She stopped. She looked at the mountain again. "If no person is responsible, then this case exceeds the scope of the Bureau's investigative framework, and I'll say so in my report." She paused. "I want to go into the drainage tomorrow." I said I'd take her. That night, I drove to Sandia Park and sat in my rental car outside Dana's house. I didn't knock on the door. I just sat there for a while, looking at the mountain rising behind the subdivision, its crest catching the last red light of the day. A 12-year-old boy had walked out of this house 9 days ago, and into those mountains. And every piece of evidence I had gathered suggested that he was still there. Not on the mountain, in it. Part of something that operated through the granite and the soil and the warm water, something that recognized his mother's presence and reached for her through stone. The notes said he was okay. The drawing said he could hear everything. The hand said he was warm, alive, present. And the last note said, "Please don't dig." I thought about what it would mean to take that request seriously. To accept that a missing child was communicating from inside a mountain, and that his communication included a specific, clear instruction to the people searching for him. I thought about what it would mean to ignore it. I thought about Dana kneeling on the warm ground with her hand held by something she couldn't see, weeping silently because she had found her son and lost him in the same moment. Found him in the sense that she knew where he was and that he was alive. Lost him in the sense that where he was could not be reached. And what he was part of could not be separated without an act that the boy himself had asked them not to perform. I did not know what the right answer was. I knew what the procedural answer was. Continue the search, bring in equipment, excavate if necessary, recover the child. That was the mandate. That was what law enforcement and search and rescue existed to do. Find the missing, bring them home. But I also knew what I'd felt in that amphitheater. The warmth that wasn't threatening. The pulse in the ground that felt like breathing. The hand that didn't grab or trap, but held. Everything about the drainage communicated something I didn't have professional language for, a gentleness, a patience, an awareness that responded to a mother's grief with the only gesture it could make through 6 inches of soil and however many meters of granite, separated the surface from whatever lay below. I started the car and drove back to Tijeras. Friday morning, day 9. I met Reyes at the trailhead at 6 a.m. Kessler was there again. She'd been on the phone with colleagues at UNM the previous evening and had arranged for a portable ground-penetrating radar unit to be brought up. It was a smaller unit than I'd seen on previous searches, backpack-mounted, designed for shallow surveys, but Kessler said it would give them a read on subsurface structure to about 30 meters. Dana was there. She was quiet, steady, ready. The 4 of us climbed together. Ortiz had wanted to send a deputy, but I'd argued against it. The drainage was narrow, the amphitheater was small, and I wanted to minimize the number of people entering the space until we understood more about what was there. He'd agreed reluctantly. The hike to the saddle was uneventful. The morning was clear, cold, windless. The sandias rose around us in their familiar geometry, granite and limestone, pinon and fir. The city below and the sky above and the mountain between them, holding whatever it held. We descended into the drainage. The arrows were unchanged. The stream was warm. Kessler measured it at 71 degrees at the first crossing, up from 68 the previous day. The rock walls were warm. The air was warm. Reyes noticed. She was trained to notice. Her profession was built on registering details that other people normalized. She stopped at the third arrow, placed her palm flat on the granite, and held it there. She said, "This feels like a building, like there's a furnace somewhere." Kessler said, "There isn't." We reached the amphitheater at 10 a.m. Reyes entered slowly. She surveyed the space the way she'd survey a crime scene, systematic. Perimeter first, then inward, reading everything before touching anything. She photographed the drawings. She read the words aloud. She studied the child-shaped figure and the concentric rings. Then she crouched beside the figure and looked at the soil. She didn't touch it. She studied the surface the way a tracker studies ground, reading the texture, the grain, the subtle variations in color and compression. She said, "The soil around the figure is different from the soil at the edges. It's finer, more uniform, like it's been processed." Kessler confirmed. She said her samples from the previous day had shown the central soil to have a significantly smaller grain size and higher organic content than the peripheral soil, despite being only meters apart on the same bedrock surface. Reyes stood up. She looked at Dana. She said, "Ms. Royce, with your permission, I'd like to observe while you make contact." Dana didn't hesitate. She walked to the center of the amphitheater, to the same spot she'd knelt the past 2 days, and she knelt down. She placed her hand on the soil. The response came within seconds. The soil rose. The hand shape formed. 5 fingers, a palm, pressing upward. And this time, as if the thing below had been practicing, learning, refining its ability to reach through the medium that separated it from the surface, the hand was more defined. The fingers were more clearly articulated. The pressure was firmer. It wasn't just pressing. It was reaching. Dana's hand met it and held. Kessler had the GPR unit running. She was making slow passes across the amphitheater floor, watching the display screen, which showed cross-sectional images of the subsurface in real time. I watched her face. She stopped moving. She stared at the screen. She adjusted a setting and made another pass. She stopped again. She said, very quietly, "Oh." I moved to where I could see the display. The GPR showed the expected bedrock surface, solid granite, dense and uniform, extending downward. But below the granite, at a depth of approximately 12 meters, the image changed. The uniform density gave way to something else. A void. An irregular cavity in the rock, roughly ovoid, perhaps 3 meters across and 2 meters tall. Not a clean void, the edges were ragged, organic, as if the stone had been dissolved or remodeled rather than fractured. And inside the void, the GPR registered a density that was neither stone nor air. Something between. Something that the instrument displayed as a pale, indistinct shape in the center of the cavity. Kessler made another pass, perpendicular to the first. The shape was consistent. Ovoid cavity, pale center mass. 12 meters below the surface, inside solid Precambrian granite. She said, "There's a cavity, 12 meters down, approximately 3 by 2 meters, and there's something inside it." Reyes was beside her now, looking at the screen. She said, "Can you determine what the interior mass is?" Kessler said, "GPR can't characterize composition. It reads density contrasts. The mass inside the cavity is denser than air, but significantly less dense than the surrounding granite. It could be water, it could be soil, it could be organic material." She paused. It could be a body. The word landed in the amphitheater like a stone in still water. Dana heard it. She was still kneeling with her hand pressed against the soil hand from below. And she turned her head and looked at Kessler with an expression that was not fear. It was protectiveness. She said, "He asked you not to dig." Reyes said, "Ms. Royce, if there's a child's body 12 meters below us, we have a legal and moral obligation to attempt recovery." Dana said, "He's not a body. He's alive. You can feel it. The hand is warm. The ground is warm. Everything here is alive." Reyes looked at me. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the federal agent's training warring with the evidence of her own senses. She'd felt the warm rock. She'd seen the hand form in the soil. She'd watched a GPR unit reveal a cavity that shouldn't exist in solid granite. And she'd heard a mother say with absolute conviction that her child was alive inside the mountain. I said, "Agent Reyes, can I speak with you privately?" We walked to the far edge of the amphitheater near the stream. I kept my voice low. I said, "I've been doing this work for nearly 40 years. I participated in recoveries where families insisted their loved ones were alive and they weren't. I understand the psychological dynamics of denial in missing person cases. This is not that." She waited. I said, "Every piece of evidence in this case, the objects on the trail, the notes, the arrows, the amphitheater, the thermal data, the hand forms a coherent, consistent pattern. That pattern says the boy is present, aware, communicating, and asking not to be extracted. I have never encountered anything like this. But I have also never encountered a case where the evidence was this internally consistent and pointed this clearly in a single direction." I said, "If we bring in heavy equipment and excavate 12 meters into granite, two things will happen. We will spend weeks cutting through Precambrian bedrock to reach a cavity that may or may not still be there when we arrive. And we will be taking an action that the subject, if he is the subject, has explicitly asked us not to take." Reyes said, "He's 12. He can't consent to his own disappearance." I said, "I know." She said, "And you're asking me to recommend that we don't attempt recovery." I said, "I'm asking you to consider what recovery means in this situation. Recovery assumes the subject is being held against his will. Everything we've observed suggests the opposite. The communication is voluntary, coherent, and specific. The contact with his mother is gentle and responsive. The thermal environment is stable and consistent with biological viability. And the message is clear. He says he's okay. He says the mountain is awake. He says, 'Please don't dig.'" Reyes looked at the ground. She looked at Dana, still kneeling at the center of the amphitheater with her hand on the warm soil. She looked at Kessler, who was making additional GPR passes, with the focused intensity of someone who had abandoned explanation in favor of documentation. She said, "I can't put any of this in a bureau report." I said, "I know that too." She said, "What I can report is that the physical search of the Sandia Mountains has been conducted to the highest professional standard over 9 days, covering all accessible terrain, and has not located the missing subject. I can report that physical evidence suggestive of the subject's presence has been found in a remote drainage, and that geological analysis of the site revealed an anomalous subsurface cavity that warrants further scientific study. I can recommend that the site be preserved and monitored rather than excavated, pending additional assessment." She looked at me. "That's as far as I can go." I told her I understood. She said, "This isn't my call. It's the family's." We climbed out of the drainage for the last time that afternoon. The four of us emerged onto the saddle in the late daylight, the wind hitting our faces after hours in the warm drainage. The city below already starting to glow as the shadows lengthened across the valley. Nobody spoke much on the descent to the trailhead. There wasn't much to say. We'd each seen the same things. We'd each arrived at our own understanding of what those things meant. And we were each carrying the weight of a decision that none of us had the authority to make alone. Ortiz was waiting at base camp. He'd scaled the search down to 2 maintenance teams. The volunteers had largely dispersed. The media, which had never gotten much traction with the story of a missing child in a mountain range adjacent to a major city, with no dramatic footage and no suspects, had moved on to other things. I briefed Ortiz privately. I told him what the GPR had shown. I told him about Reyes's position. I told him that in my professional judgment, continuing the search in its current form would not locate Caleb Royce, because Caleb Royce was not on the mountain in any sense that a search team could reach. He listened. He rubbed his face with both hands. He said, "I've been a cop for 16 years. I've worked missing kids before. They're alive or they're dead. They're somewhere or they're nowhere. This is the first time I've had a case where the kid is somewhere and alive, and we can't get to him, and he's asking us not to try." I said I didn't have a framework for it either. He said, "What does the mother want?" I said I thought he should ask her directly. He did. That evening, in the command tent, with Reyes and Kessler and me present, Ortiz sat across from Dana Royce and asked her what she wanted to happen. She was quiet for a long time. She looked at her hands, the hand that had held her sons through 6 inches of warm soil and 12 meters of ancient granite. She looked at the evidence bags on the table, the shoe, the wrapper, the bottle, the notes. Objects her son had sent to the surface for her, piece by piece, like messages in bottles released from the bottom of an ocean that wasn't water. She said, "I want my son back." Nobody spoke. She said, "But I don't think getting him back is something we can do. I think he's part of something now. I think he was always drawn to it. I think the mountain was always talking to him, and on that Saturday morning, he went to listen. And he went too deep, or it took him in, or he chose to go. I don't know. I will probably never know." She looked at Ortiz. "Don't dig," she said. "He asked you not to, and I'm asking you not to. If he's alive in there, and I believe he is, then digging is not a rescue. It's a surgery on something that we don't understand, and it might kill whatever is keeping him alive." She stopped. She breathed. She held herself together with the kind of structural integrity that I have seen in very few people, in very few moments. She said, "I'm going to keep walking this mountain. Every day. I'm going to walk to that drainage, and I'm going to put my hand on the ground. And I'm going to hold his hand for as long as he reaches back. That's what I want." Ortiz looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at me. I looked at Dana. I said, "I think that's the right decision." The formal search for Caleb Royce was suspended on day 11. Ortiz filed the paperwork. Reyes submitted her report to the Albuquerque field office. I never saw it, but she told me later that it described the case as unresolved, with physical evidence suggesting the subject remained in the search area, but in a location that was not accessible by conventional recovery methods. She recommended the site be classified as geologically sensitive and protected from disturbance. Kessler published a paper 7 months later in a regional geology journal. It described an anomalous thermal feature in the eastern Sandia drainage system, characterized by localized rock warming with no identified geothermal source, and a subsurface cavity at 12 meters depth with unusual density properties. The paper was cautious, technical, and scrupulously limited to what her instruments had measured. It did not mention a missing boy. It did not mention a hand in the soil. It did not mention Dana Royce. But in the acknowledgments, she thanked the individuals who guided me to the site and demonstrated that some phenomena must be witnessed before they can be measured. I stayed in New Mexico for 3 more days after the search was suspended. On the last day, I drove to Sandia Park and knocked on Dana's door. She invited me in. The house was small, clean, and full of a boy's presence. Books on geology and astronomy stacked on the coffee table, a telescope by the window aimed at the crest, drawings pinned to the refrigerator in a hand I recognized from charcoal arrows on granite walls. She made coffee. We sat at her kitchen table. I asked her if she'd been back to the drainage. She said yes, every day. She said the hand was always there when she arrived. She said it was getting stronger, the fingers more defined, the grip more certain. She said the ground had started doing something new. When she placed both hands down, the soil would warm beneath her palms and then cool in patterns, warm, cool, warm, cool, in sequences that she was beginning to recognize as intentional. She thought he was trying to communicate something more complex than touch. She thought he was trying to develop a language. I asked her how she was. She looked at me with clear, steady eyes and said, "I'm a mother whose son lives inside a mountain. I'm not okay, but I'm not broken either. I'm learning something that I don't think anyone has ever had to learn before, and I'm doing it one day at a time." I nodded. I drank my coffee. I looked out the window at the Sandias, standing in the morning light exactly as they stand every morning, solid, silent, old beyond any measure that matters to a human life. I asked her one more question. I asked her about the morning Caleb left, the hug. She smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile. She said, "He knew. I don't know how, but he knew he was going somewhere. And he wanted me to know that it was his choice." That's what the hug was. It was goodbye, and it was "I love you." And it was, "I'll find a way to reach you." She looked at the mountain. And he did. I drove back to Flagstaff that afternoon. I took I-40 west through Grants and Gallup, across the high desert, watching the landscape change from the Rio Grande Bosque to the red mesas to the Ponderosa country around home. I thought about Dana Royce, walking into a warm drainage every morning to hold her son's hand through the earth. I thought about Caleb Royce, 12 years old, sitting at his rock garden looking out over the city, listening to something in the granite that no one else could hear. I thought about the last note he'd left on the trail, the one that said, "Please don't dig." 3 words written in pencil on ruled paper by a child who understood, somehow, that the adults would want to tear the mountain apart to reach him, and who knew that reaching him that way would destroy whatever he had become part of. I don't tell this story to convince anyone of anything. I don't have a theory about what happened to Caleb Royce. I don't know what's inside the Sandia Mountains. I don't know whether what I saw in that amphitheater was a boy communicating through rock or something else, entirely, something older, something that found a boy who was listening and drew him in, something that uses warmth and touch, and a child's handwriting to speak to the people who come looking. I know what I measured. I know what I felt. I know what I saw Dana Royce experience, and I know that her face, when that hand held hers, was the face of a woman who had found her child. 5 years after the search, I received a letter. No return address, postmarked Albuquerque. Inside was a single sheet of ruled notebook paper, the same kind from the trail notes, torn along the same perforated edge. On it, in the same careful child's handwriting, was a drawing, the concentric circles, the mountain from above, and below the drawing, 2 words. Still here. I keep the letter in a box in my closet with my service records and my field notebooks. I've never shown it to anyone. I don't know how it reached me. I don't know how anyone or anything knew my address in Flagstaff. I don't know whether Caleb Royce is alive, in any sense that the word typically means, but I know that Dana Royce still walks that drainage every morning. Kessler told me the last time we spoke. She said Dana had worn a path into the amphitheater floor, and that the drawings had faded everywhere except around the child-shaped figure, which remained sharp and dark and warm. She said Dana reported that the hand still came every time, without fail. And she said something else. She said the thermal anomaly had spread. Not much, a few meters per year. The warmth in the drainage extended a little farther uphill each season, as if whatever lived beneath the granite was slowly, patiently growing toward the surface, reaching upward the way the hand reached upward through the soil, not to escape, but to be closer to the woman who came every morning to hold its hand and say her son's name. I don't know what the Sandia Mountains are. I thought I did, once. I thought they were granite and limestone and time, and that everything they contained could be mapped and measured and understood. I was wrong about that. There are rooms inside the earth that no instrument has found, and there are presences in the stone that no discipline can classify. And sometimes a 12-year-old boy walks into the mountains behind his house and finds something that has been waiting for someone who could hear it. And sometimes his mother follows him as far as the rock will let her go. And she puts her hand down, and the mountain puts its hand up. And the distance between them is 6 inches of warm soil and everything that science cannot yet explain. That's the closest I can come to the truth of it. It's the closest